Hello, welcome, Cabbage here. So let's look back at Nier Reincarnation, the first and possibly only ever Nier series mobile game. It is touted as Nier 3 by the creators Yoko Taro and Saito Yosuke. It was published by Square Enix, developed by Applebot, went 3 years in Japan and in the global markets, except for C, which got 1 year. One thing I should make clear up front, this video is not a story synopsis. This is a retrospective from a Japanese mobile game industry watcher's point of view. We're going to talk about the industry climate in which the game was released, compare both the gameplay and monetary performance of Reincarnation to other mobile games, assess the developers' handling of the game, and look at both the Japanese and global community's reactions to the game. As for the industry watcher, that's me. I have watched it with great interest since about 2012, when it really started to find success in Japan, with the form factor of the smartphone and games like Monster Strike and Puzzles & Dragons. The industry has gone through many changes over the decade, and I got to a point where I felt I had seen it all, but then Nier Reincarnation was announced. Looking at the pre-release trailers and live streams, and then playing it launch weekend, I saw how unique this game was, and although I was ready to retire from mobile games at that point, I put it off for Reincarnation because I knew this game and its developers were going to be fascinating to watch, whether it went 1 year or multiple. Reincarnation did not disappoint, and the total experience surpassed any other mobile game I had played, and many console games. I feel lucky to have played it, and doubly so in English. It's very easy to have imagined that this game would have been Japanese only, but what a gift to get the entire game on the same schedule in my native language. I am very grateful. In a community post, I shared this chart. I made this to lay out the sales numbers of the game over its life. Official sales numbers are of course not shared with the public for any mobile game, but there's one type of data that is shared and reliable, the Apple App Store sales rankings. Looking at this, we can compare the performance of games to each other and extrapolate the sales numbers from there. How exactly? I don't know, but I trust my source that uses these. But even if the numbers were not exact, it wouldn't matter because there are only 3 things that we are concerned about. A, Nier Reincarnation taking number 1 in the sales rankings on release day, and that's verified. B, the change in performance year over year. And C, when the game enters the danger zone, and the conventional wisdom on this is that the 10,000 line marks the danger zone for how likely a mobile game is to be shut down based on the history and trends of the industry. To sum up the sales performance of the game over its entire life, it had a massive debut, a healthy first 6 months, the whole of 2022 skimming the danger zone, the whole of 2023 sinking deeper and deeper into the danger zone, and 2024 shutting off monetization in January, I believe it was, and then shutting down service a few months later. I'll go into more detail as we go, year by year. Let's go back to pre-release times and revisit the announcement trailers. Many people were impressed with the graphics and the design of the cage, many asking if this was actually on mobile. And I was also really interested in the cage. This was one of the things that got me into the game. I'm a fan of Ico and that series of games, and so is Yoko Taro. Another thing that struck me was the muted presentation visually and the obvious focus on story. Most mobile games are very colorful and busy with bright music, but Reincarnation was done according to Yoko Taro's tastes, which are more subdued. And then, the choice to have a focus on story was interesting because story does not sell in mobile games. Users pulling the gacha is the main way Japanese mobile games make money. It's doing cool characters with power creep jumps and or collaborations. Story is generally made available to all players. Of course, there are ways to monetize story. Some games make you have to pull a certain character to unlock a story, or some games require your account to be a certain strength to unlock a story, but those are rarely popular with the users. As we saw with Nier Reincarnation, however, 100% of the main story was viewable by free-to-play users within maybe a month of play, and among all side or supplementary stories, only the Recollections of Dusk stories required a developed account. This was consistent across the course of the game, but so much effort and care and money was put into the story and they made pretty much no move to monetize it. Pretty unusual in the mobile game industry. You could call the game a gift of the stories, an extremely high-quality play novel for free. Alright, let's talk about the launch in February 2021. At this point, it had been 4 years since Nier Automata released, but Square Enix does a great job to support Automata with events and merchandise and collaborations with other games in order to keep the game and the series alive in the minds and hearts of fans, and it really paid off in Reincarnation. They launched the game with the Automata collaboration where we could pull 2B, 9S, and A2, and on its release day it took #1 in sales for the day, which is a gigantic event in the world of Japanese mobile games. I cannot stress enough what a big deal that is. The Nier name proved itself to be strong, and good sales continued the next half year. Out of the gate, the game really focused on Nier-related collaborations with Replicant and Dragon Dragoon 3, and the return of Automata at the half anniversary with the addition of 2P. And it worked. It got a lot of people into the game, and it took a good amount of revenue. It's safe to say that they made back what they invested into developing the game. I perhaps famously said in the life of the game that it was cheap to produce. I heard that line repeated now and then by other people. I said that because in an early livestream, producer Saito Yosuke said most of the staff on Reincarnation was young. Maybe this was their first or second job, and in Japan, the pay is done on a hierarchy scale. Other ways the game saved on costs were a bare-bones friends and PvP system, a simpler battle system that would be relatively less complex to balance and program, many of the stories being text-only, a limited roster of characters getting multiple costumes rather than creating a whole bunch of new characters, almost zero advertising and marketing, and keeping the number of game modes low and updating them as little as possible. That's not to say the game cost nothing to develop, however. There were expensive things in Reincarnation to produce, such as the high-quality 3D character models, their high-quality animations, the cage, the collaborations, of course, the voice acting, and the localization. On that last point, text-only stories are cheap to produce in their native language, but translating those to other languages can be expensive if there is a lot of volume, and Nier Reincarnation certainly had a lot of volume. Also, the quality of translation was some of the best I've seen in mobile or console. Localization teams or individuals with a greater sense of cultural nuance do cost more, and I can count on one hand during the 3 years when I thought something was strange or off with the English localization. And voice acting, for some reason, has a reputation for being cheap, but no, it's expensive. And as we saw, the English voice acting got axed after the Sun Moon arc. Apparently, it was enough of a cost that it was worth cutting in order to keep the game going. Getting back to the launch, the Japanese community really crapped on the gameplay. Nier Reincarnation is boring even started trending on Japanese Twitter, and the game never really shed that reputation. As I said in my gameplay review that I made towards the end of the game, I said the battle gameplay is nothing special, but it's serviceable. This is, after all, a story-driven game with gameplay stapled to the side. Most games are gameplay-centric with story stapled to the side, but Nier Reincarnation was the opposite. The big problem with the battle gameplay was the way it was presented before release. The early PR was somewhat deceptive, and it led to a lot of backlash. I feel like the trailers should have emphasized more that it was an ATB-style RPG with command attacks, instead of making it look like an action game like Automata, with the behind-the-character view. A lot of people picking up the game were expecting it to play like Automata, which I think the developers should have foreseen, or maybe they did foresee it and went ahead with it anyway. Also, I think the choice to include the ability to run around in battle was a mistake. That reinforced the expectations it would play like an action game, and deepened the disappointment when it was discovered it did nothing. A PR miss, and I wonder if the launch would have gone better if the battle graphics were more 2D, side view, like maybe the storybook-looking Scarecrow stories. Regardless, the launch of the game did well enough that we were able to get the game for 3 years, I want to say. That, combined with what was effectively the end of Nier series collaborations after the 6-month anniversary, led to a lot of people leaving the game, and the game not taking the typical steps to raise sales led to longtime industry watchers like me to wonder what was going on, what were the developers doing. Sales dropped into what I call the mobile game shutdown danger zone and never recovered, and based on the performance of other Square Enix mobile titles shutting down at the time, a shutdown of Nier Reincarnation any time after the 1-year mark would not have been surprising. Indeed, talks of the game shutting down were rampant in the JP community towards the end of 2021. But here we got another convention-breaking occurrence with Reincarnation. Producer Saito announced in a livestream the game was not shutting down in the near future. I cannot emphasize what an unusual move this is in the Japanese mobile game industry. Development teams have opened up a lot over the last 10 years, but on less than noble topics like money, sales, and the health of a mobile game, they're still very cagey. They want to maintain the pure image that they are totally committed to making the game better and not at all motivated by money, so typically on those topics, they prefer to let actions speak for themselves. But producer Saito just came out and said it. That's very much in line with his personality, which is another reason why I got into Nier Reincarnation. I just like him and how frank he is. But producer Saito making that announcement was a big deal because by saying it himself, he was essentially putting his trustworthiness on the line. He was putting his considerable clout and reputation behind that statement, and the company name on the line. If the game had shut down like in the next 3 months, that would have been a great hit on his reputation and his company's reputation. But because his reputation is so strong, pretty much everyone believed him on it, and I personally interpreted it to mean at least another year of the game, whatever the sales look like. And then we got the Sun Moon arc, which did go for a full year despite sales never really climbing out of the danger zone. Here we can go back to the chart and look at how 2021 played out in particular. And it's interesting to look at this because it's an intersection of game development and business and human psychology. This is part of why I like to watch the mobile game industry. Again, massive opening day and month, and again, I'm guessing that they made back their entire development cost, which I'm guessing led to the more elaborate Plan B for the game, rather than the shorter Plan A. I'll explain that later. Then a few solid months with the Replicant and DoD3 collaborations, and then a drop-off in summer, but I think what we're seeing here is people saving for the half-year anniversary, which typically mobile games feature powerful units. There were the first anniversary units, but more importantly, A2 returned, who was at that time the only unit anyone ever needed. She could carry your account by herself. Then we see a drop-off and actually enter the danger zone in December, even with Christmas units, but there too, people were saving for both New Year's and anniversary in February. As it turns out, February is a shrewd month in which to release because you get typically high-selling summer and Christmas leading right into anniversaries and New Year's, other typically high-selling periods. Nier Reincarnation, as we can see, did not capitalize, but another game came out a week after Reincarnation, Musume, currently one of the jewels in Japan's mobile game crown, and I'm looking forward to the global release of that. But yeah, so much was kind of lucky and felicitous about the release of Nier Reincarnation, including coming out before Musume. If it had come out after, it almost certainly would not have gotten number 1 in the sales ranking for the day. Also in 2021 was the re-release of Nier Replicant. This is going to come up again, but having multiple releases kind of side by side of one property, Nier, is going to strengthen both. People that are drawn to the series by Reincarnation, they'll have more exposure to Replicant, and then the other way around as well. Perhaps that led to more sales of both Reincarnation and Replicant during this time. I certainly got into Replicant thanks to Reincarnation. Next, we can talk about another thing that is very typical about mobile games. The first release of a pullable character post-launch in a new game is a big deal, and Reincarnation went with F66X in the JP version. Very unconventional choice, and here we can segue into talking about the unusual character design of Nier Reincarnation and how it reflects kind of the artistic vision the developers had. Both F66X and 063Y are unusual in their design because they are bald. If you know anything about Japanese pop culture, you know that hair is a giant part of a character's identity. Sometimes it's the only differentiating factor between characters. And so, to have no hair is almost like saying these characters have no identity, which turned out to be foreshadowing. But from an industry point of view, releasing a bald character, to say nothing of releasing a bald character as your first post-release, is like putting up a giant neon sign saying, "We are not here to make money." Another unusual design choice is Gale, which might seem strange since she is one of the most popular characters, but she has prosthetic limbs. Mobile games are there to make money and so release kind of, beautiful and whole characters. What happens with characters that are not whole is that they remind the user of our own mortality. They make us feel uncomfortable on a level. Gale's state of incompleteness actually mirrors the baldness of 063Y and F66X. There is a strong stigma in Japan connected to both, and I personally felt the designers including these characters in the game was them saying, "We see you," to real-life players that are missing hair or missing limbs or have some other kind of difference. Another example of an unconventional character design is Argo, a gruff, middle-aged guy who wears rags and has a beard, nearly the perfect recipe for an unpopular character in Japan. If the game were interested in making money, they would have made his daughter the playable and pullable character, since young women always sell better, but Reincarnation stuck with Argo. And actually might have been Yoko Taro's favorite character, kind of the impetus for the entire game. And one last character I'll point out as unconventional design is Priyat, who's almost certainly a parody of Japanese obsession with hyper-deformed, cute, mascot-type characters. She has a lot in common with those characters at first glance, but we look closer and we see that she has a lot of her that is disturbing or frightening. There is her size for one thing, her true face is another, her twisted voice is yet another, and then her obsessive nature is yet another. Next, let's look at the chart for 2022. We see a bit of a jump in January. That is where we saw people saving in like November and December. Sometimes mobile games release their most powerful units on New Year's, and probably Reincarnation fans were anticipating that. But it turns out Reincarnation does not function like that, so we saw the drop-off in future New Year's sales numbers. We see that trend in anniversaries and other holidays as well, and it turned out the only true bumps the Nier Reincarnation game got were in collaborations. May had a nice bump with Final Fantasy XIV, September got a nice bump with Persona 5, but See No Alice in November did not move the needle, and indeed it didn't even get it out of the danger zone, which must have been eye-opening to the developers. But although the game did not have a big user base and wasn't making a ton of money, I would say that 2022 was the best time for the game. Game balance was good, power creep was reasonably paced, game modes like subjugations and PvP Arena were getting interesting, the developers' handling of the game was pretty smooth, communication was good, and the story was still top-notch, if not better, than the Girl Monster arc, with the introduction of the Sun Moon arc. Among the industry watchers, the game was mostly forgotten. The general impression of it among non-players was, oh yeah, that was that game that took number 1 on release day, but now is tanking, and I wonder why it's still around. But to cap the strong 2022 year as far as game design, was the addition of the 3D viewer and the Recollections of Dusk game mode. The 3D viewer was mind-blowing because it was very powerful for a mobile game, and it was better than some console viewers. Just like story, 3D viewers do not make game money, and a viewer of that level of quality definitely costs money. They even added facial expressions, which meant the developers went back to the 3D models and created new eyes and mouths and even teeth. That was a lot of work and cost, I'm sure, added there. But yeah, the 3D viewer was so powerful and so popular that for a lot of users, it was kind of their endgame. They spent a lot of time in there taking photos, and even to this day, months after shutdown, I see people putting up photos that they took in that viewer. And for me personally, if there was one thing that they could have saved, like in an offline mode, it would have been the 3D viewer. Even more than the stories, even more than the cage. I wish that they had kept the 3D viewer. And the new game mode, Recollections of Dusk, At first, just seemed like new endgame content that they would add to any mobile game, but along with the secret stories also introduced in 2022, it marked the beginning of the countdown to the end of the game. We didn't realize it at the time, but in retrospect, that is how it worked out. The game would ultimately wrap up with the completion of both series of stories, which I can tell you is not how mobile games typically work. Many have shut down in the middle of a series of stories, including Applebot's previous game, Grimoire A. Money is the reason for 99% of games continuing or shutting down, so I was playing the odds in saying that those series were no guarantee of the game's minimum lifespan. But of course I was hoping that it would go that far. I was hoping it would be in the 1%, and it does look like it was. Again, getting the game to completion, and all in English, was such a gift and an anomaly in the industry. For whatever reason, however, it was also at the end of 2022 that in the global community, talk sprung up about saving the game, which heavily implies that the game was in danger of shutting down. I saw this and I rolled my eyes because 1. Can the game even be saved? 2. Does it need saving? And 3. I guess the ideas for saving it were the same ones global users in various Japanese mobile games have dreamed up for years, which never ever pan out, and it turns out that I guessed right on the last one. To elaborate on the first 2 points, could the game have been saved? That ship had sailed by the 6-month point. Story doesn't sell, people felt betrayed by the battle gameplay, and the game stopped doing Nier collaborations. From the 6-month point on, all the way to the end of the game, the majority of the user base were the long-time hardcore users, as they mentioned multiple times in live streams, and new users were not coming into the game, which are typically the lifeblood of a mobile game. With that hardcore-only user base, a mobile game is pretty much only left to milk that core, which they did attempt in 2023, but failed at, partly because it was so late in the life of the game and the economy was well established. It is much easier to go from a strict system to a lenient system than the other way around, which Nier Reincarnation attempted. I forget when I said it, but the only way that the game could make money was to shift to a character and costume collector, put out new versions of A2 and 2B and 0 and Kaine every couple months, but the game stubbornly never went that route, so the game could not be saved. That brings us to the second point, asking if the game needed to be saved, and I personally didn't think so, because I was one of the few that considered the possibility that the game might be on a predetermined lifespan. There are mobile games that do that. Some announce it ahead of time, like, hey everyone, this game is going to go 2 years, that's it, get it while you can, while others don't announce it, and Reincarnation in retrospect kind of looks like that. You look at the clean completion of the main story, the completion of the Recollections of Dusk and Secret Stories, the near complete release of Abyssal costumes, no Argo, damn it, and then all of it coming together timing-wise despite poor sales all along, and it really looks pre-planned on a schedule. It was my guess all along, but I feel vindicated looking back that the game never needed saving. It was going to do what it planned to do, regardless of convention. And then we get to 2023, which was so rough and controversy-laden. We can go to the chart first. But yes, this is the year where sales really tanked. My thinking as to why is because the somewhat simple game systems and battle gameplay had reached their limits. Pretty much every mobile game gets to this point, and they have kind of 2 options to go with. Either introduce new systems or speed up power creep. Reincarnation attempted to go with new systems, but they turned out to be the old ones with a new look, and players saw through that, so the developers in response sped up the pace of power creep and introduced more exploitative banner structures, especially in the latter part of the year. Players saw through this as well, and sales kept going down and down. Final Fantasy XIV returned, and we got a Dragon Quest collaboration, but they didn't sell at all, which is striking. If anything is going to make money for Japanese mobile games, it's those 2 franchises. But what that said to me was that new players were not joining the game, and the old players were simply overspending in the game. But one odd blip in the year was April, with the release of a new 2B and Nier, and this is very telling. It shows a conflict between what the developers wanted and what the players wanted. I mentioned this earlier, but I felt that the best way for the game to make money past the 6-month point was to become a costume and character collector. You can't make money on the story, you can't make money on the 3D viewer. By 2023, you couldn't make money on the gameplay either. But console main characters like 2B and Nier, they can drive sales, as we saw. Looking at these sales overall for all 3 years, one curious aspect about the sales performance is that there were no real spikes for holiday or anniversaries. Generally, mobile games do get spikes at those times when they release strong characters and cute costumes, but Reincarnation, no. The only times the game experienced spikes were during collaborations, and those were modest. None of them sold as much as the first half year. What this tells me is that the Reincarnation original characters were not driving sales. I held this theory for a while, but I got what I considered confirmation with that release of the new costumes of 2B and Nier. It was 50% more than any of the previous 6 months, and about double every month following it. I don't point this out to imply the Reincarnation original characters are unlikable, just that they don't inspire the crazed devotion of the console game main characters, and more importantly, that the developers must have known this and chose anyway to not pump out the console characters because, I assume, they were sticking to their artistic vision. Yet more evidence that Reincarnation is a rare, unique mobile game. Turning to in-game issues during 2023, power creep sped up, game balance swung more extremely, monetization became more of an obvious focus of the developers, communication majorly dropped, developer programming and planning was at times incompetent, at times tone-deaf. The new game mode, Recollections of Dusk, was updated again and again, and ultimately made less fun and more of a mindless chore, partly because the developers didn't have the chops to make it work the way that they wanted. The only good thing, I think, which kept long-time hardcore users in the game during 2023 was the story, which, to the game's credit, maintained a super high level of quality on a regular schedule. But for folks that were not here for the story, that were more here for the gameplay, the year was a true test of patience, and a few very big names dropped out of the game because of poor handling of the battle and game mode and gacha aspects. I could go on and on about how bad 2023 was, but I've done enough of that in real time on my videos. You can look back at that if you like. The bright spot for Nier in 2023, besides the always excellent stories in Reincarnation, was the Automata anime. I talked about the first season before, link below, but having, again, 2 projects running side by side from one intellectual property is special and difficult to coordinate. This is going back to the idea of releasing more sub-media to keep the main media, the Nier Automata console game, alive in the minds and hearts of fans. And I'm sure they were hoping the anime would translate to better sales in Reincarnation, but it didn't, as we can see. We did get a reference to Reincarnation in the anime, however, and that was great to further legitimize it and make us more excited about the future of Reincarnation in the greater Nier picture. Also, earlier in 2023 was the first real legitimate shutdown scare, I would say. I didn't think it was particularly worth talking about until that series of events, and then I talked about it a lot, so I could give the global community a heads up on what the real signs are and what aren't, and what a lead up to shutdown could look like. I have a series of videos called a crash course in Japanese mobile games, I'll link to that below as well. Quite a few things happened in the first 3 months to warn of impending shutdown, including losing English voice acting, getting multiple premium limited time banners squeezed into a short time frame, the shutdown of the C server, sudden unexplained overly generous handouts in-game, and better performing Square Enix mobile titles getting shut down in bulk. But again, I want to stress that throughout all of this, I always kept in the back of my mind the possibility that this was a game with a predetermined lifespan, and that these moves were not signs of a shutdown, but signs of a shortening of the predetermined lifespan. That's a subtle difference which I think was lost on a lot of people. I always felt that Reincarnation was not on a strict schedule of time or money, but a semi-flexible schedule with a definite endpoint based on story. And I think that was very much helped by the power and influence that both Yoko Taro and Saito Yosuke had. They've always been the aces up the sleeve of Nier. And a funny thing was that despite the recent talk about the game needing to be saved, people got angry at me instead for saying the game was possibly in danger. I was talking about the subject to educate and warn the user base, but they interpreted it as me trying to sabotage the game. Nonsense, of course. Goes to show that some people care more about who is saying something rather than what they are saying. Nier Reincarnation limped into 2024 with pretty much a communication blackout. It gave up its ineffective exploitative monetization setups, and then announced shutdown. The typical response I saw at the announcement was people looking at the last 6 months of revenue, which were the worst in the life of the game, and concluding it was poor sales that led to the decision. I can understand people outside of the user base coming to that conclusion. But I looked at how cleanly the game tied up various threads all at the same time, and I feel that even if the game had maintained its regular level of revenue those final 6 months, it still would have shut down at the same time. Again, being on a clock based on story. Kind of a side note here, going back to my Plan A, Plan B idea, an interesting thought experiment is to imagine what would the main story have looked like, how would it have worked in a trimmed down version, if, say, the game bombed at launch and had had much less time than 3 years. I first thought this playing through the Sun Moon arc. It was pretty well removed from the previous story, and I had to wait until nearly the conclusion of the whole game to think that yes, it could have worked without the Sun Moon arc. Not to say that I dislike it, I loved it, and replayed it and made videos of that playthrough, I'll link to that below as well. We got the extended Plan B with the Sun Moon arc and then the first part of the People World arc. But let's think about how Plan A could have gone, a truncated version of the main story. Girl Monster plays out as it did, then jumps to People World at the Moon Base reveal, where we meet 10H. Hina and Yusuke would not have been introduced, so 10H would have spent more time interacting with the Girl Monster characters, or just spent more time alone. Perhaps 10H could have been the one that walked through the museum section, summing up the Nier series' major happenings. Then, 10H sacrificing herself to get Mama and the rest to Earth, that would have played out the same, and then everything on Earth would have played out the same. If the game were on a tighter schedule, this could have been how it would work. The biggest loss for me, personally, with Plan A would have been the loss of the Recollections of Dusk stories and the Secret stories, which did so much to expand on and conclude the Girl Monster character arcs. But yes, again, we were very lucky to get what we got, and thank you to everyone that put money into the game. You got us this, essentially. Getting back to the concept of a mobile game shutdown, from the mobile game industry watcher point of view, one fascinating thing is looking at how a game handles its shutdown. I talked about this in my Crash Course series of videos, but it can go really one of two main ways, with a whimper or with a bang, and Reincarnation definitely went out with a bang. But more for the users, not for the developers, because along with the shutdown announcement, they turned off monetization, so the game gave up any last push of monetary support from the users, which restored some of its story-first, monetization-last reputation it had damaged so much in 2023. But once again, various stories were wrapped up, there were lots of handouts, they had one last PvP season, they held multiple live streams, and most surprisingly to me, they released an all-new playable character in 10H. This is another aspect where I can't stress how unusual this is in mobile games. Games that have shutdowns announced do not typically release new characters because, of course, players are going to take personal offense at a last, desperate, greedy effort to get them to open their wallets. But then in Reincarnation's case with the monetization off, that meant that a lot of investment was put into this character with the knowledge that the game would get nothing from her development and release. That is commitment to the story and the user base that I have rarely seen in mobile. It reminds me of, spoiler alert, playable Kaine at the end of Replicant version 1.22, but it's even beyond that level of generosity since a playable 10H was much less integral to the story than a playable Kaine. I've had some people ask me about the final month of the game where there were no updates. Perhaps they were thinking the game was actually ending with a whimper because of that, but on the contrary, that is part of going out with a bang. Nier Reincarnation technically shut down end of March, and then the month of April was the offline, unupdated version. That last month was there, like a grace period, to give new users one last chance to experience the game, and to give longtime users one last chance to accomplish personal goals like subjugation scores, or unlocking stories, or taking pictures in the 3D viewer. The game could have easily just disappeared at the end of March, but they gave us a bonus month. And we can end the retrospective with looking at the greater Nier community reaction to Reincarnation shutting down, and it played out pretty much like you would expect in the global community, which is depressing. Even among hardcore Nier fans in the global community, they could not bring themselves to play Nier Reincarnation because Japanese mobile games with their monetization models and gameplay loops have such a bad reputation. Even with the monetization turned off, the fact that it was ever in the game, some people argued that playing the game would be to support that model, and therefore on moral grounds they couldn't play the game, even though they love Nier. I even saw some people try to dismiss the canonization of the game in the greater Nier lore, but Yoko Taro put an end to that himself, stating repeatedly that Reincarnation was Nier 3. Yoko Taro's and producer Saito's message at the end of the game was actually not unique among mobile games, but was maybe surprising to folks more familiar with console games. The players who enjoyed Nier Reincarnation in the moment are the select few, part of a special club, and the developers said that they were okay if the game didn't reach everyone, not even every Automata or Replicant fan. I think that is a striking point of view from a global or Western perspective. Clearly, a lot of work and love went into the creation of Reincarnation, and it was done with the knowledge that it would reach only a limited audience and then disappear. Is that admirable? Is that smart? Is that an efficient use of time and energy? I feel like a lot of global people would say no. But Yoko Taro and the team knew all this and went ahead with it anyway, and it felt very in line with their philosophy on gaming experiences rather than products. And so, Nier Reincarnation on a meta level ended up being kind of a test for users. Could we get beyond our biases of mobile games, good and bad, and meet Reincarnation on its own terms to experience something very different and special? Some had an open mind and passed the test, and many more kept to their preconceptions or preferences and didn't pass, just like what happened with the convention-breaking console games Automata and Replicant. And for me personally, having watched the mobile game industry for 10 years, to essentially retire from mobile games on Nier Reincarnation is so perfect. Most likely, no other game is going to be able to tell such a great story with such high production values, with such freedom. We are not going to see the likes of Nier Reincarnation again. Alright, so that was my retrospective of Nier Reincarnation. Very special game to me. I put a lot of myself into the coverage of this game, and I got a lot out as well. When I was revisiting kind of old trailers, old footage, I was getting a little emotional. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again. Take care.